Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the council's called back in order. We are now on file item number 8, members, the report on the lower San Joaquin River issues. Mr. Ray, I think you're up. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Bradley. Where's Mr. There you are. Mark. Sorry. Okay. Mr. Bradley, Mr. Lund, Ms. Riddle, Mr. Grober. You're the only one with a computer in front of you. What conclusion should we draw from that, Mr. Bradley? Other than you're an engineer.
And it is Engineers Week.
Uh-huh.
But the conclusion you should draw is that the Phase 1 document is a 1,500-page document. And so if questions did come up, without killing a whole tree, we wanted to be able to get to maybe what we needed to get to.
Okay. Why don't you start off, Mr. Bradley? Tell us who's joining you and how you're kind of organizing the presentation.
Okay. Well, good morning. Or good afternoon, sorry. We moved past that. Chair Eisenberg, council members. My name is Mark Bradley. I'm a staff engineer with the Delta Stewardship Council. I'm joined this morning by Les Grober, Assistant Deputy Director for Water Rights at the State Water Resources Control Board. And he is overseeing the revision of the Bay Delta Plan, the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. And Jay Lund is here on behalf of the ISB. So a little bit
Jay
about...
Lund is, for those of you who don't know him, is a science board member, professor extraordinaire of engineering, planning, and ecosystem and all that at UC Davis, and one of the well-known PPIC authors of various studies.
Yeah, deeply knowledgeable in all water issues.
And he writes funny blog posts available through, what's it called? No.
California Water Blog.
California Water Blog, worth a read.
So just for a little bit of background, this is item 8 on the agenda, the lower San Joaquin River flow objectives and Southern Delta water quality item. The State Water Board is in the process of revising the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Phase 1 began in 2009, and Phase 1 deals with the flow objectives for the San Joaquin River. Phase 2 began in 2012. It's an update of the flow objectives for the rest of the Bay Delta Plan, including Sacramento River flows, the Delta outflows, and the Delta export objectives as well. This is consistent. These elements are consistent, and us engaging on these is consistent with the draft Delta Plan. The draft Delta Plan says that minimum flows must be established for the Delta and its major tributaries as part of a comprehensive effort to address all ecosystem stressors. And the draft Delta Plan goes on to direct the State Water Board to update Delta flow objectives and to achieve the COCO goals flow objectives to achieve the COCO goals by June 2014. Mm-hmm. So, and that's coming up. This afternoon, we'll be talking just about Phase 1 of that process. It's the bigger water quality control plan change for the Bay Delta, but we're just going to talk about Phase 1, the San Joaquin part. First, Les Grober will provide an overview of the Phase 1 proposed approach, and then I'll talk about our comments on that and our perspective, and then Jay would talk about the ISB's recent conversations on this.
Very good. Thank you for having me here this afternoon. I'm happy to give you an update on our process and our products. I know some of you might have various levels of, have tracked this to various amounts, to various extents, so please, if I kind of gloss over something or start using acronyms or something, please stop me, and I'll fill you in on the details. But as Mark had said, this is part of a multi-phase process, and the big new item was that at the end of last year, at the very end of last year, I think we took some flack for that even in the press, because we delivered the news on New Year's Eve. We released our 2,000-page report, which was the substitute environmental document. And that's a substitute document, or we call the SED, because we are a certified regulatory organization, so we can rely upon a substitute document rather than a full-blown EIR, but it's substantially the same thing. So we released not just that document, but also the updated proposal for water quality objectives. And that's the two parts, the San Joaquin River flow objectives, and that's to protect fish and wildlife beneficial uses in the San Joaquin River, and also Southern Delta salinity objectives, or objectives in the Southern Delta to protect agricultural beneficial uses. So And those two things are kind of related. They're both on the southern side, the San Joaquin River side. So that's part of the logic, part of the impetus for phasing it. It's also part of the logic and impetus for phasing it, to refresh some of your memories, is because that's something that we could carve out discretely from the comprehensive update of the Water Quality Control Plan. And also part of that comprehensive update of the Water Quality Control Plan involves things that are being reviewed as part of the BDCP. So it's something that can stand alone. So we put out this SED, and we've also, sorry about the bump in volume. We put out the SED and the proposed objectives. Previously, and as Mark said, we started this process in 2009. In the interim, we had many public workshops. We developed the scientific basis for the proposed objectives. And we released all of those things sequentially to get comments on it. And we appeared before the Delta Independent Science Board, got feedback. We've had a lot of public process. But at this point now, the full package is out, both the proposed regulation and the environmental documents that evaluate what would be the environmental effects of the proposal. And that's very important because this type of a process, this type of proposal, it's not like the science just suggests, well, there's just one number, that the flows need to be this to do this. Well, the flows need to be something within some kind of a range, and then you need to, in our parlance, consider what are the competing uses of water, because, of course, proposals such as this will come at no small water supply cost. So it's, in your parlance, it's the co-equal goals. But in our view, it's all the competing uses. So we have to consider hydropower, agricultural water supply, municipal, industrial, recreational, all of those things. So the reason for preparing it in the process that we did sequentially is here's the science that was prepared initially, and then we prepared all of the environmental effects, which included what are the hydropower effects, what are the agricultural economic effects, the water supply effects, and that's why it fleshes out those 2,000 pages in the SED, to help with anybody that wants to review and just get at the crux of what is being proposed. You could really do it by looking at just about the 15 pages of the proposed objectives and the program of implementation, and then the 50 or 60-page executive summary that has then some of the summary effects. So focusing on the San Joaquin River flow objectives, and these were flow objectives to protect the fish and wildlife beneficial use, specifically anadromous fish, salmon, migrating salmon. And it's looking specifically at the outflow migration period, that February through June period. So what the proposal has, and now I'll just carve out some of the things that are distinct from the current flow objectives. The current flow objectives are in the form of just numeric objectives that vary by season and year type, and just for the San Joaquin River at Vernalis. That's the inflow, that's the boundary to the delta. The proposal is recognizing the need for continuity, connection of flows. It is now proposing flows for the salmon-bearing tributaries to the San Joaquin River, the Merced, the Tuolumne, and Stanislaus River. And rather than just a simple prescription, just simple numerics, it's saying what some percent of unimpaired flow. So it automatically varies by water year type. It varies by the hydrology. So it provides variability within years, between years, and also, because it's for the 3 salmon-bearing tributaries, a connection of those salmon-bearing tributaries and through the delta. We evaluated a range of alternatives looking at 20%, 40%, and 60% of unimpaired flow, and we went out the door with a proposal that is 35% of unimpaired flow. And then a lot of the rest of, or at least...
I thought that you had done... I'm sorry, this was in the November 2010 report you did for the legislature on Delta, but you had studied a higher range of potential flows in that, up to 75%?
You're speaking, and this is some
ecosystem only, not a balanced test.
That's correct, and that's some of the history here to add richness to our process. We started this process to update the plan in 2009. We had a slight bump or a detour or added value, depending on your perspective. We did a report to evaluate, well, if you don't look at these competing uses of water, just what are the flow needs for the various tributaries? And you're correct, we did it now for the delta in total, and we determined that if you don't consider any of the competing uses and you consider just the current condition, it had determinations that it's 75% of unimpaired flow on the Sacramento. On the San Joaquin side, the upper number that was proposed, the number that was proposed was 60%. So that's the rationale for the upper end 60%, was to address, well, that's the high-end flow, that if you didn't have to consider competing uses, if it didn't have a cost, that's a high-end flow that would be of benefit. And at the low end, 20% was more or less reflective of the current condition. And I say more or less because it depends what tributary you're talking about. 20% is generally lower than what's coming out of the Stanislaus now, but it's generally about the same or even to some extent higher than what's coming out of the Merced and the Tuolumne. And I'm already bandying about terms such as unimpaired flow. Unimpaired flow is a metric. It's not the same as a natural flow, but it's something that we can measure and calculate that roughly approximates natural flows or flows of a more natural pattern. So it therefore provides a handy mechanism by which to develop a flow prescription because it achieves that more flow of a more natural pattern. And 35%, to put that in perspective, currently on the Merced and the Tuolumne, during that period from February through June, you can have months, and particularly in dry years, where the percent of unimpaired flow can be in the single digits, even down to 2, 3, 4% on occasion. So we certainly hear, and the board is certainly hearing that, well, 35%, that's too low. And I'm sure you'll hear that from many ecologists, fishery biologists. But on the water supply cost end, 35% is quite a significant increase over the current condition, particularly on the Merced and the Tuolumne, and that's what results in the water supply costs that are disclosed in the environmental documents. So the proposal, getting back to how different, it's rather than specific numbers that vary by water year type with a specific prescription, it's saying, well, this thing flexes as a percent of unimpaired flow. But we realize rigid adherence to any flow prescription, even something like that, is going to be less than optimal both for fishery protection purposes, but also for water supply purposes. So also in the program of implementation, we have the critical component, which is that this can be adaptively managed. So it doesn't require rigid adherence with the 35%, but in various tiers and requiring the formation of various groups to evaluate in real-time conditions, it allows for changes in those flows within that February through June period. At the first tier, if you will, it would allow for, well, you can vary it and say maybe have a higher pulse flow in a critical period like April, May, which is similar to how it's managed now, that might go upwards of 40, 50, 60% of unimpaired flow, but come down to a lower amount during those shoulder months. But that's something that would require analysis, recommendation by a fishery organization or a group where we're recommending or would be required as some kind of coordinated operations group to manage this thing in real time. The requirement being that so long as you provide that 35% of unimpaired flow in total for that February through June period. So it's a quantity of water to be used and best managed to, again, optimize fishery protection and to minimize the water supply costs. And it's perhaps a time to delve into the water supply costs. Is many of the critical things. It's not just about agricultural water supply, but it's about hydropower. And as you would expect, by shifting flows now earlier into the spring months, this comes at some cost to hydropower generation. Even if not in total generation, you now would be generating power at a less lucrative time. So all of those things, and I could go into more detail if there's interest for all of those things, all of those things lead to those water supply costs. So the board has gone out with a 35% to balance those needs. So getting back to the adaptive management, that also allows for over the longer term, well, maybe 35% isn't even the right number. Our process, we started in 2009. We periodically update the plan. Well, to go out the door with a number that's not right, and we get information that shows, well, we really should be at a higher number, or we're really squandering water, it should be something lower, so that we don't have to go through years of process. This also provides a mechanism for the board to adaptively manage down to 25% or up to 45%, so that we don't have to go through a long process in the presence of new information that shows we should do one thing or the other. And that, of course, has benefits and it has costs. It provides some uncertainty as to, well, what will it be? And there's concern for the water supply side. Well, how do we know it won't go up to 45? Well, we've evaluated, that's again part of the reason for evaluating the document, we've evaluated what would be the effects of that entire range from 20 to 60%. So it certainly encompasses what we're going out the door with, the 25 to 45%. So the ultimate purpose is to be a little bit more nimble in our ability to respond to changing conditions and changing information, amongst which includes, of course, climate change. We have ability to periodically review and update the plan so that if we start seeing greater effects from climate change, we could make even more substantive changes to the plan. But still, we've tried to build this thing to both have the flexibility and the adaptability with sufficient certainty to achieve the goals of fishery protection. So that, in a nutshell, is how it's what it is and how it's different. And as always, I focused a lot on the flow part of it. There's the other part, which is Southern Delta salinity, which is generally not. Of course, if you're a farmer in the South Delta, that is of significant interest. That is not the part that has been as controversial and is drawing as much comment as the flow part. But the salinity proposal is, in summary, it's proposing to modify the current objectives for the Southern Delta. We currently have seasonal objectives of 700 microsiemens per centimeter in the irrigation season through April through August, and 1,000 for the rest of the year. We're proposing 1,000 year-round because part of that scientific effort that's gone on the last few years, part of that effort was focusing on, well, what is the quality of water that is needed to support all crops in the Southern Delta? And those reports determined that 1,000 is sufficient, though there might be issues in the Southern Delta having to do areas with poor circulation, backwater areas, things like that. 1,000 would provide a reasonable protection of the agricultural beneficial use. And getting back to the relationship of these proposals being advanced at the same time, incidentally, higher flows in the spring period in the San Joaquin River would have the added benefit of providing dilution flows, leaching an opportunity for leaching of salts from the Southern Delta. So as a package, that would generally be of benefit to the Southern Delta. So that brings us to that's the proposal and where we are. As we've noticed in the when we released the SED, we have a workshop that's coming up in March 20th, and it's going to be for 1, 2, or even 3 days if needed. Originally, the comment period was ending before that. We've determined to change the comment period to March 29th, so people can continue to provide comments after we've heard from them. And then we're going to make revisions to the document as necessary and get it back to the board and make changes, release it again for another review. You're familiar with multiple review periods for documents, I presume.
Boy, are we.
And getting to a decision point in August or September for a final plan update. And all of this is concurrent with, as Mark said, continuing to make progress on our Phase 2 effort and also Phase 4 efforts.
I apologize, but just one question. I did not read the draft suggestions on the approach you're going to take on the adaptive management in terms of structure, composition, timing, and all the other stuff. Is it possible to do a shorthand summary of that?
Sure. We within about 180 days of plan adoption or plan approval by Office of Administrative Law would require the development of an implementation work group to say, well, how do you figure out some of the details of how you're going to measure and even do things? When I say measure and do things, for example, one detail of the program implementation I didn't mention is that it calls for a 14-day averaging period to meet that 35% of unimpaired flow. Well, is that the right averaging period? We went out the door with that because that, once again, balances the ability to monitor information and operate to it, and it still provides enough of the responsiveness, peakedness of the flow patterns to be of benefit to the fishery use. that group might determine, well, you really could narrow it to a shorter time period because there's information that suggests that that would be of greater benefit to the fishery use because by doing a 14-day averaging period, you're lagging things, and maybe that's less than optimal. So some of those details of where you would measure, how actually you would calculate this, where you would need to do it in the tributaries would be developed by the group during that time period. Then within 360 days, it calls for implementation of a what do we call it? There was the COG, a Coordinated Operations Group,
Right.
and that would be the group that could be making recommendations as to how you would make
And it's
divert
recommendations to board staff?
to the board staff and to the board, yes. But all of this then, but that then it could be any member of the COG that could, or anyone for that matter, that could suggest, say, a divergence from the rigid adherence to the 35%, but it would take the full COG on a year annual basis or within year basis to say, well, we need to actually change a percent or do something else. So it provides the different levels of effort by those participating in the group to inform the board's function. But what it also allows, recognizing that we could have gridlock or lack of concurrence for any proposal, the board on its own motion can develop over the long term, could make some adjustment down to 25 or up to 45% to adaptively manage during that time period. So all of this is crafted to allow for some of what goes on now, because if those of you familiar with the VAMP, there was an experiment to provide some flows, pulse flows. It provides the opportunity to do all of those types of things in real time and still be in compliance with the water quality control plan.
The last thing I noticed in Mr. Bradley's memo summary, which I liked a lot, that you are proposing here that the plan itself and data upon which the plan or revisions are based are to be publicly available.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I envision, and this is something to work out with that implementation group and the COG, I think that there will likely be a role there for the Delta Science Program and in visiting with the Science Board, because we all know that adaptive management is key to success to many of these things. We think we've provided a sufficient framework and also sufficiently incentivized that to occur, but it would be, of course, good to make sure that what is crafted is science-based. And when I say incentivized, the plan calls for as a backstop rigid adherence with that 35% of unimpaired flow, recognizing that's going to be far less than optimal, and that's where the incentivization comes in, is that, well, both from the fishery perspective, water supply perspective, there is benefit for these groups to come together to figure out a better way to do it.
Mr. Fiorini.
Les, thanks for coming, and I've got a few questions. Thank you for mentioning the Vernalis Adaptive Management Plan, VAMP, because in the documentation we received on our staff report and the summary report, the only mention of VAMP that we received referred to the desirability of a rock barrier at the head of Old River as opposed to the bubble, sound, light, disco barrier. Okay. There was no mention of 12 plus years of flow studies that were associated with VAMP. Were you around in the mid to late 90s when the Vernalis Adaptive Management Plan was put into place?
Was I around? Well, do I look that young? I mean, was I involved in the development? No, I was not. I was not involved in the development of the VAMP, but I have tracked it because I was working on the San Joaquin that time. But and you might have more of a question, but to anticipate part of it, but something I neglected to say, which is important. This is certainly always more than just the flow, and the reason the VAMP informs and other things inform is that we're also soliciting as part of this release, this draft release, is information on other measures that would be needed in conjunction with the flow measures. So that's things like predator control, hatchery practices, habitat restoration. All of those other things are important. We tend to focus on, and we go out with the flow parts of it because that's our core charge direction, but we have opportunity in the program implementation to identify other things that we already have in a draft form, other things that are important to protect the beneficial use. We're looking for suggestions from you and others as to, well, how do we add rigor to those other things? So, sorry.
No, that's a good point. And you, in your summary report, did a good job of listing all of the other stressors. I think in terms of predation, it focused on structure removals that provide cover for predator fish and things like that. And I think it would be a good discussion to have how to add rigor to controlling some of the other stressors besides flow. But I bring up VAMP because the purpose of that was actually the genesis of that was a settlement of a lawsuit brought by the San Joaquin River tributaries in the face of required higher flows in the tributaries and the lower San Joaquin. They cited that there was no scientific evidence to suggest that higher flows would yield better fisheries. So it was a 10-year project that was approved, and pulse flows were initiated prescriptively in May and November, and the populations and the impact that it had on the salmon fisheries was monitored. Can you tell me what we learned from that study?
From the VAMP study?
Yeah. In terms of the impact of additional flows on the health of the salmon fisheries, the Merced, the Tuolumne, the Stanislaus, and the lower San Joaquin.
Unfortunately, not conclusive, because VAMP was designed to do various things, associating different flow regimes with different barrier operation and with different project operations. So we didn't get to test all of the high flows and in conjunction with all of the export operations, and also towards the end of it, because of constraints on barrier installation, we didn't even have the barriers necessarily formed. But it did show that there are more things involved than just flow, that it is important also in terms of some of the operation of projects, but also barrier. And we certainly did find that predation is, one of the things that can affect these populations. So all of those things were determined that it's about more than just flow. It's about predators and pathways.
Well, that's my impression, and I was somewhat familiar with that project as it was underway. So we're required as a Delta Stewardship Council to apply best available science to whatever policies we advocate or recommend. Isn't it curious that a project like VAMP that was designed to evaluate how much impact additional flows could have on the health of the fisheries, and ultimately it didn't yield any, I think anybody would agree that the health of the salmon fisheries in that stretch of the river complex is unchanged as a result of those additional flows. And that the most significant finding in that was that predation was nailing the outgoing, the outmigrating smolts and fry. And even NEMPS has come on board and said, we need to do something about that. It's gone to Fish and Wildlife, onto the Fish and Game Commission. They refused to do anything about it. And that was apparently, based on scientific study, the number one problem that identified. Excuse me.
Maybe I'll use that as an opportunity to respond to part, and then it's a pity to not have the visuals, some of the graphics that use when talking about some of the things like this. But I might have shown some of you might have seen some of this, but as an illustration of both the concept of unimpaired flow and also as it relates to the current flow regimes. We've shown now, imagine if you will, a graph that shows the current flow pattern. You can see the San Joaquin River, the current flow is for any given time generally, except for high flow conditions, is pretty much flatline, a little bit of a rise in this February through June period, and this slight bump for April, May, which was the VAMP period. If you compare those flows generally to the proposal now, you will see generally higher flows for that entire period and a significant increase over that April-May period. So at least part of the problem with the VAMP, it didn't test particularly high flows. They were still relatively small flows and providing a very small bump for just a 30-day period, which was the way the VAMP was designed. So the science that informs and it's difficult in terms of how it's being advanced and what the scientific basis is, but it's difficult to advance it any more than more flow and of a more natural pattern, because that does two things. It provides the higher flows that necessarily provide various functional flows for outmigration, which, again, flow is not a substitute for more direct controls for water quality issues, things like that. But even with regard to habitat, predation, if you have such low flows during periods, it's like, well, it becomes, and of course there's going to be predation, because two things have happened. You generally have, not very well-reared salmon that have an inability to get by the predators and insufficient flow to evade them. So again, not to suggest that flow has to be the remedy, and that's why the plan calls for the comprehensive evaluation of these other things. But flow is critical in providing that in-stream water habitat to get by some of those things. And the VAMP didn't come close to testing any of those higher flows on a more sustained basis. So, but another point in terms of the VAMP, because that's part of the impetus for the approach that the State Water Board is using now. As you said, we went out with a flow prescription, a specific prescription that had higher flows than the VAMP ultimately provided. The board recognizes that the best thing to come out of this is an agreement, a settlement as to, well, what do some of the water users agree to do? This provides, again, the incentive, and those discussions are occurring, because it would be better to achieve some level of flow and not end up in court. I think most would agree for 10 or 20 years. But the information is suggesting that it needs to be more and more natural pattern, and we've crafted now this plan to accommodate a settlement that could fall out before we go into the implementation phase. So that would also avoid the two-step that we did last time with the VAMP, where we went out with the water quality control plan. The VAMP was proposed, and then we were sued and lost because we approved the VAMP, but the court said, well, no, you didn't duly implement your plan. So then we had to revise our plan and to conform with the settlement. So your point is well taken in terms of the VAMP and many other things that are going on, but that's in large part then the reason for the adaptive management, because there's another challenge, if you will. If more effective direct measures such as habitat restoration, predator control can be employed, this program allows for dropping down to the 25% so as not to squander the water.
You mentioned that the flows in the Stanislaus have been historically or recently on a par with what you're prescribing in this draft, and that the flows in the Tuolumne and the Merced have been less than that historically. Has the salmon fishery on the Stanislaus been significantly different or better as a result of those increased flows than the Tuolumne and the Merced?
And I'm afraid getting out. I don't have the numbers, and I couldn't speak to that directly in terms of the better or not. I don't know.
Well, that probably would be useful information.
And I think we have that information. I can't speak to it myself.
But wouldn't that be an indicator as to whether or not this prescriptive flow would have a beneficial impact? If you've got a river that's been modeling that, and I know that the district biologists and the fish counts that occur every year, we've got a lot of good documentation. It seems like that would be the basis for the scientific reasons to require more in-stream flows.
And I think that we've developed that information, but there's also the differences between the tributary and the areas of potential habitat and that. So it wouldn't necessarily inform a direct comparison, because there's greater potential, or there's somewhat greater potential for habitat to take advantage of that with higher flows on the Merced and the Tuolumne, I know, than there is on the Stanislaus, given the barriers to fish migration that are, and the geometry of the tributaries, if you will.
Just one final question. The 1,000 CFS base flow at Vernalis, is based on releases from Exchequer, Don Pedro, and Maloney's, the three rivers. It doesn't take into account the water in-stream flows from Friant. When that comes online, it's my understanding that the Friant watershed is about equal to the Tuolumne watershed, which is about half of the three rivers that we're looking at now. So that would lead me to believe that Friant will be contributing 500 CFS to achieve their fair share. What will happen then? Will the other three tributaries be allowed to reduce the amount that they're contributing, or will this, whatever Friant contributes, be added on to the 1,000 CFS at Vernalis, and that becomes 1,500?
This is crafted because it's still speculative as to what is going to be happening with the restoration flows, but this is meant to stand alone for the requirement just from the Merced, the Tuolumne, and the Stanislaus. And this is not to say that those would not be adjusted as part of the adaptive management, but I say it's speculative as to what's coming out from the restoration flows because it's still not known where that water will be picked up. Is that going to become part of the flow in the San Joaquin? Or because I know there's interest in trying to pick up that water someplace further upstream, so it wouldn't even necessarily contribute to the flows in the lower San Joaquin River downstream of the Merced. But that would have to be encompassed as part of, well, we have more information now that has base flows coming in upstream of the Merced. Is it possible to flex these down below the 35%? That's part of the adaptive management.